I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
President Trump in the Oval Office as his new 25% global tariff on steel and aluminum sparks retaliatory tariffs around the world.
We have been abused really for a long time, and we will be abused no longer.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never ever happen.
The trade war between the United States and Canada did not erupt over small disputes. It detonated at the very heart of 5 critical sectors: aluminum, steel, copper, nickel, and clean energy. Washington believed tariffs could weaken Ottawa, yet the outcome looks very different. Instead of crippling its northern neighbor, the strategy triggered a boomerang effect, one that rattled America's own industries to the core. Within weeks, aluminum and steel prices in the U.S. jumped by as much as 20%, forcing companies from Ford to Boeing into record-high production costs. Copper markets shed billions in value almost overnight, while electric vehicles suddenly carried thousands of dollars in added costs. General Motors even projected a 15,000-unit cut to its EV line for 2026 as nickel prices surged, translating into billions in losses. And in clean energy, the supposed future of America, over $14 billion in projects were abruptly canceled, wiping out 10,000 jobs, even as Canada poured $500 billion into rebuilding its energy infrastructure. So the paradox emerges. A campaign meant to punish Canada may have instead elevated it into a rising resource superpower, while leaving the United States trapped in a crisis of its own making. If this is the price of economic warfare, what happens when the next round of retaliation begins? Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button. A simple like helps push this video to more people who need to see it. And that shockwave in metals set the stage for Canada's most unexpected move, transforming aluminum into a strategic weapon. While U.S. manufacturers struggled with soaring costs, Canada quietly rebranded its resource advantage. More than 100,000 tons of aluminum, once destined for American factories, were redirected to Europe and Asia, markets eager for cleaner alternatives. In Quebec, giants like Alcoa and Rio Tinto leaned on abundant hydropower, cutting emissions by nearly 80% and meeting the European Union's strict carbon standards. The result? A surge in demand for so-called green aluminum, with Canada's low-carbon exports climbing over 20% in just the first quarter of 2025. This wasn't just raw material, it was a premium product commanding higher prices on the global stage. Meanwhile, across the border, U.S. output lagged, down more than 10% compared to pre-2017 levels. American icons from Ford to Boeing to Molson Coors faced mounting losses, their cost base warped by tariffs and the absence of affordable supply. The contrast couldn't be starker. Canada was turning aluminum into leverage, while America was bleeding competitiveness. Still with us? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next. If aluminum showed how Canada could outmaneuver the U.S., steel revealed just how quickly defense could turn into offense. When Washington imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, the intent was to shield American producers. Instead, the impact landed hardest in Detroit. By July 2025, shipments of Canadian steel into the U.S. had collapsed by nearly 100%, leaving automakers scrambling for alternatives that simply weren't there. Ford alone reported an additional $2.5 billion in costs during the first half of the year, a burden that translated directly into higher car prices for American consumers. What was meant to be protection quickly morphed into a hidden tax on everyday buyers, amplifying inflation in one of the most visible sectors of the economy. Canada, meanwhile, refused to remain cornered. Ottawa launched a $1 billion steel modernization fund, channeling resources into advanced electric arc furnaces and hydrogen-based direct reduction iron. It wasn't just a bailout, it was a blueprint for Clean Steel 2035, a long-term bet on technology that would leave conventional producers behind. And the strategy gained instant credibility abroad. Canada secured a carbon passport deal with the European Union, granting its steel exemption from carbon border tariffs and unlocking access to premium global markets. And if steel marked the breaking point for Detroit, copper became the true nightmare for Washington. The White House justified a 50% tariff under the banner of national security, but the result was a severe shortage that undercut its own industries. Within just 24 hours, America's copper market shed $4.2 billion in value as prices spiked 13% to nearly $6 per pound. Canada responded with precision. Rather than retaliate broadly, Ottawa froze all contracts with U.S. buyers and redirected its copper to South Korea, Germany, and India, partners eager to secure stable supply. To sustain this pivot, the Canadian government pledged $1.8 billion toward expanding ports, rail lines, and refining capacity, ensuring that future exports flowed even faster to global markets. The ripple effects inside the United States were immediate and brutal. Electric vehicle manufacturers saw production costs surge by $3,000 to $6,000 per car, while housing projects absorbed an extra $17,000 to $22,000 in material expenses. What began as a tariff aimed at protecting security instead exposed just how fragile America's industrial foundation had become when copper slipped beyond its reach. If copper exposed America's vulnerability, nickel drove the point home. By slapping tariffs of 20 to 30% on Canadian supply, Washington aimed to tighten control over the EV supply chain. Instead, the policy squeezed its own automakers. General Motors saw profit margins on electric vehicles fall from 10% to just 8.5%, and projections for 2026 were slashed by 15,000 units, an estimated $3.2 billion in losses. Canada, by contrast, turned nickel into a magnet for global investment. Ottawa imposed a 15% export tax on raw nickel, a move designed not to punish, but to prioritize refined, low-carbon nickel for high-value partners in Europe and South Korea. In Ontario, hydropower smelters produced nickel at just 4.2 tons of CO2 per ton of metal, a fraction of the emissions from Indonesia or China. That environmental edge made Canadian nickel one of the most sought-after resources in the global green transition. The results were immediate. South Korea increased its imports of Ontario's green nickel by nearly 20% in the spring of 2025, cementing Canada's role as a preferred supplier in the fast-growing EV battery market. While America struggled with bottlenecks and rising costs, Canada was quietly repositioning itself as the indispensable partner in the industries of tomorrow. Nickel may have revealed the cracks in America's EV ambitions, but the clean energy sector exposed the full scale of the divide. While Washington stalled, canceling more than $14 billion worth of renewable projects, Ottawa pressed forward with an entirely different playbook. In New England alone, electricity costs are projected to rise by $500 million per year starting in 2028, an invisible tax weighing down households, small businesses, and entire state economies that had once counted on clean energy to bring relief. Canada, by contrast, approached the moment as a chance to rebuild its foundations. The expansion of LNG Canada, the rollout of the Darlington Small Modular Reactor, new export terminals along the Quebec coastline, and the opening of fresh mineral sites together formed the architecture of a sweeping industrial renaissance. These weren't isolated projects. They were parts of a coordinated national energy strategy, backed by $500 billion in investment aimed at turning resilience into advantage. Ottawa also seized the chance to redraw trade maps. By diverting $38.4 billion worth of oil and LNG exports away from the United States and toward Europe and Asia, Canada secured long-term contracts with partners desperate for stable and cleaner supply. This diversification didn't just reduce dependence on American buyers, it gave Canada leverage, ensuring that no single market could dictate its future. At home, the impact was equally profound. Energy infrastructure projects sparked thousands of high-skilled jobs, from engineers and technicians to port workers and miners. Communities once reliant on traditional industries found themselves woven into the fabric of a cleaner, more globally connected economy. The result was not merely a pivot to renewables, but a structural transformation that tied economic growth to sustainable energy. For the United States, the picture looked very different: hesitation, disrupted plans, and mounting costs. For Canada, the same period marked the start of a new era, one in which energy security and economic power became inseparable. And while Washington argued over tariffs, Ottawa was busy building the future. What Washington imagined as punishment for Canada ultimately landed squarely on the shoulders of its own people. Over the past 12 months, U.S. energy prices climbed by 5.5%, double the consumer price index of 2.7%. For households already straining under higher food, healthcare, and mortgage costs, this wasn't a geopolitical maneuver. It was another bill they couldn't escape. Electric vehicles, once hailed as the pathway to independence from fossil fuels, suddenly carried price tags inflated by thousands of dollars. Families who had hoped to transition to cheaper, cleaner transportation were forced to delay purchases or stick with older, less efficient cars. Housing costs spiraled upward too, as builders passed along tens of thousands in added expenses tied to copper wiring and steel framing. For young couples or first-time buyers, the dream of homeownership drifted further out of reach. Even the digital economy, America's crown jewel, felt the shock. Data centers driving artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and cryptocurrency mining found themselves hit with unprecedented energy bills. For companies operating on thin margins, every spike in electricity costs chipped away at global competitiveness, making it harder to attract investment or sustain rapid innovation. What was supposed to secure America's technological future instead became a drag on its momentum. North of the border, the contrast could not be sharper. By leaning on hydropower, wind, and nuclear, Canada not only held prices steady, but also offered predictability, a quality increasingly scarce in global markets. That predictability became a magnet for new factories, research hubs, and long-term investors seeking stability over volatility. In effect, Canada managed to transform calm energy markets into an economic advantage, while the United States turned turbulence into its own disadvantage. What began as a bilateral trade war has become a signal to the world, the dawn of a new era built on clean resources. Canada is no longer just a reliable supplier. It is positioning itself as a metals and energy superpower for the 21st century. By mastering green aluminum, clean steel, low-carbon nickel, and renewable energy, Ottawa has turned vulnerability into dominance. The United States, meanwhile, has lost credibility and market share, leaving space for Europe, South Korea, and India to seize opportunities once taken for granted. The message is as simple as it is unsettling. In the decades ahead, those who control clean metals and renewable power will shape the future of the global economy. So here's the question. If Canada can rewrite the rules of trade and energy in less than a decade, what happens when other nations follow? Will the U.S. adapt? Or will it watch the very foundations of its economic power slip away? If this video gave you something to think about, like and subscribe to support more content like this. Thank you.